What is the most dangerous fight in combat sports? Is it the co-main event, where two fighters are evenly matched and both have a world title on the line? Or maybe the main event where the champion is a heavy favorite and their challenger is just trying to pull off an upset? Well, actually, the most dangerous fight doesn't happen inside the ring or the octagon. It happens beforehand. It's not a fight that fans pay to watch. It's one that they don't. It's the fight to make weight. But before we get going, make sure you subscribe for more videos like this. A few weeks ago, we made a video about how MMA fighters gain weight. And now, it's time to talk about the other side of that coin, how fighters lose weight. But before we can do that, we need to set the stage. So let's go back to that weigh-in. Let's say it's for a 170-pound championship. That means that all the fighters competing at that event have to weigh in at 170 pounds or less. But when it comes time for them to step on the scale, they probably don't weigh exactly 170 pounds. They weigh a lot more than that. That's because fighters do unusually cut all the weight that they need to make on the day of the weigh-in. What they do on the day of the weigh-in is simply prove that they can make weight. They're almost always a little heavier than 170 pounds. But they have a couple hours after the weigh-in to cut the last few pounds. Now, cutting that last bit of weight isn't hard. It's pretty straightforward. Just stay hydrated, work out really hard, and sweat. As long as you start the process a few hours after the win with enough time before the fight, you should be fine. But here's the problem. Fighters do and wait until after the weigh-in to start the process of cutting that final bit of weight. Instead, they start dehydrating their bodies, days if not weeks before the weigh-in. This isn't a recent development either. Weigh-ins in combat sports have been happening since the 19th century. And throughout history, fighters have basically done the same thing to make weight: dehydrate their bodies as much as possible. In fact, back in the 1920s, boxers would basically starve themselves for days on end just to make weight. It was so bad that at one point, the New York State Athletic Commission passed a rule that forced boxers to eat regular meals during the week leading up to a fight. But even though the rules have changed since then, the mentality has remained the same. Fighters today still dehydrate their bodies for days on end to make weight. This might sound like a good idea. After all, if you're trying to lose a few pounds, it makes sense to start the process early. This way you're not cramming all your weight cutting into one day. But the problem is that dehydrating your body for days on end does some serious damage. For starters, when you dehydrate yourself, your body has to put all its energy into rehydrating itself, so you feel sluggish and slow. This might be okay for a heavyweight who's just relying on their power, but for anyone else, it can seriously hinder their performance. But that's just the beginning. If you dehydrate your body for too long or too intensely, it can cause all sorts of problems, from kidney failure to seizures to even death. Of course, no fighter wants to die in training, but sometimes it's hard to know where the line is. That's because dehydration is a very effective way to lose weight. All you have to do is reduce your water intake and get rid of all the salt in your diet, and you will be shedding pounds in no time. In fact, a lot of fighters will also throw in a sauna to speed up the process. And what makes this even more complicated is that dehydration can lead to something called hypovolemic shock. This is a condition where you have low blood volume, which can lead to all sorts of complications, from low blood pressure to organ failure. Hypovolemic shock is actually one of the leading causes of death in combat sports. And while it might seem obvious why a fighter would die from this, it's not always the case. Sometimes a fighter might seem fine during training, but then they collapse in the middle of a match and die from hypovolemic shock. Now, there are ways that medical professionals can treat this condition, but it's not easy. That's why it's important to catch hypovolemic shock early. But here's the thing. It can be really hard to tell if a fighter is suffering from hypovolemic shock. They might seem fine on the outside, but on the inside, their bodies are shutting down. This is why it's so dangerous. By the time it's clear that something's wrong, it might be too late. So why is this practice even legal? After all, it's not like fighters are dying on purpose. It's usually an accident. Well, it's hard to say exactly why this practice is still allowed. Maybe it's because it's been around for so long. Maybe it's because there's no easy way to stop it. Or maybe it's because people just don't realize how dangerous it is. Whatever the reason, it's led to a number of high-profile deaths. In 2016, an Irish boxer named Patrick Clark died after collapsing during a weigh-in. He was only 22 years old. In 2014, A British boxer named Mike Towell died after suffering brain damage during a match. And in 2012, an Australian fighter named Johnny Lewis died after collapsing in his dressing room following a bout. These are just a few examples. There have been many others. Of course, not every fighter is willing to take the risk. Some fighters have died while trying to cut weight. Others have retired because they can no longer cut weight. Some have switched to different weight classes so they don't have to cut as much weight. But the vast majority of fighters still have to cut weight, and many of them are pushing the limits. Here's what I mean. Take Nate Diaz, for example. He's one of the most popular fighters in the UFC, and he's never shied away from a challenge. But when he moved up to welterweight, he had trouble making weight. In his first fight at 170 pounds, he missed weight by nearly 3 pounds. To be fair, he did make weight for his next fight at 170 pounds, but he had to do it in a way that almost killed him. In fact, Diaz spoke about it afterwards. "It was brutal," he said. "I haven't cut that much weight in a while. I haven't done that to my body in a while." He wasn't kidding either. Diaz lost 13 pounds in 7 days leading up to the fight. That kind of weight loss is extreme, even for someone as experienced as Diaz, and he's not the only one. Most of the top fighters in the UFC have had similar experiences. When Georges St. Pierre returned to the UFC in 2017, he missed weight for his fight against Michael Bisping. St. Pierre ended up winning the fight and the middleweight title, but he later admitted that he had a tough time making weight. "I felt horrible," he said. "I was dehydrated. I was drained. I was suffering." It's a similar story with Jon Jones. In his last fight, he missed weight by nearly 9 pounds. Now, to be fair, Jones later explained that he missed weight because he was protesting the UFC's drug testing policy. But that doesn't change the fact that he still missed weight. In fact, it just makes it worse because it shows that Jones didn't even care about making weight. Now, none of this is to say that missing weight is a big deal. After all, it's not like these fighters are dying from it. But it does show that these fighters are willing to go to extreme lengths to make weight. And that's what it takes to compete at the highest level in combat sports. Now, I'm not saying that combat sports are dangerous. They're obviously dangerous. But it's important to remember that fighters aren't the only ones taking risks. Their trainers and coaches are also putting themselves on the line by helping their fighters cut as much weight as possible. In fact, some coaches have even been accused of forcing their fighters to cut weight dangerously. Take the case of Greg Jackson, for example. He's one of the most respected coaches in MMA, and he has trained some of the best fighters in the world. But in 2013, he was accused of forcing his fighter, Diego Sanchez, to cut weight dangerously. Of course, this is just one example. There have been many others. It's hard to say how common it is, but it does happen. And that's why it's so important to talk about. Now, I'm not trying to say that all combat sports are dangerous. Obviously, they are. But it's important to remember that fighters aren't the only ones taking risks. Their trainers and coaches are also putting themselves on the line by helping their fighters cut as much weight as possible. If you want to see what it takes to train a champion, check out this video about how MMA fighters gain weight. And if you want to see how MMA compares to other combat sports, check out this video. Thanks for watching.